Okay, we are still like three minutes to begin. I'm not sure whether I can see everyone. Let's see. I think there has been some let me see, some inconsistency in terms of the crowdcast timing and the timing that we have posted. Probably that's one of the reasons why some people might still not joined us. Let me just have a look at it. Okay. I definitely think there has been some timing issues. Hi Vidya, how are you? Great to see you back. Today is supposed to be something which is quite important, and I feel it might help a lot of you. Don't see anyone live on Crowdcast. Probably the timing issue is one problem. Vidya, can you come over to Crowdcast and see if you can't come over to Crowdcast today, Vidya? Can you come over to Crowdcast and see if you can join us on Crowdcast? We actually have we are actually streaming from Crowdcast, but it's just that happens to be that there has been some timing related inconsistency issue for this particular episode. It's supposed to be from 8 p.m. It's supposed to start now, but on Crowdcast is showing 8:50 p.m. So that I don't know for what reason, but for some reason it has there's some inconsistency. Okay, so the link is let me just give you the link for Crowdcast. So this is the link for Crowdcast. All right, so let's start. I guess this unfortunately probably the Crowdcast people would not be able to join us over here, but they can definitely join on YouTube chat. Okay, let's start. So let me share my screen. All right. So so tonight, as I was saying, that this is the second part a sequel to the first part, which was how to design your experiment. So tonight we are going to talk about how to conduct your experiment. And just for those people who are very new to Rax, who do not know a little bit, to give you a little bit of context. So Rax, the website is Raxter.io. You can later on visit it and play with the tool. So we are a literature analysis and comprehension tool. It's an AI-powered tool that helps you to dissect and critically analyze the paper very, very quickly, to compare and contrast papers together to see where the similarities are, where the dissimilarities are, as you're reading multiple different papers across your PhD journey, and to figure out uh, how how you can actually look into a particular paper in multiple different dimensions, and how you can enrich your knowledge while you are looking a paper in in multiple different dimensions, and how you can expand on top of it, right? So just play with it whenever you get some time. um, so I begin with this starting point of and this would be the starting point for the entire series, because if you look at it very carefully, you'll see that your research career depends upon your results. Because if you don't get the results, you wouldn't be able to do any progress in your research career. So the entire objective of this entire series is to make sure that you actually get to the results, and to make sure that the results are meaningful, to make sure that the results are accepted by top quality researchers, and then to make sure that, because if they get they get the right kind of attention, they get the attention that they deserve, and thereby improving your visibility and your reputation as a researcher, right? So that's the idea. So just to summarize yesterday's, or rather last Wednesday's discussion in episode number 1, at an upper level, at a broader level, you start with a research question. So that's the center point. And you apply certain research methods to investigate the research question, to address the research question. And after doing so, you come out with a claim of your own, which hopefully has to be an original claim, right? So so that's kind of like the upper thing. That's what everybody does. Whenever you are writing a paper or you're reading a paper, these are the 3 things that's happening in that paper at a broader level. If you go one step deeper down, what you are saying is that, okay, so if you start from a research method, and when you are applying that research method, you will come to certain kind of findings or results. And then what you do with that finding, you start analyzing the findings, right? And then what do you do with that? And after the analysis is done, you try to use that analysis to support your research claim, right? To establish your research claim. So that is what happens at a deeper level. And when we talk about evaluation, experiment, especially evaluation in the sense of experimentation, what we have to do is we have to make sure that our research method is has the right kind of rigor, is strong, right, and can be defendable, right? And when I say defendable, not just in terms of the reviewer, but also in the larger context, in terms of your research community, right? So there are 2 purposes of evaluating your research method. The first purpose is to make sure that there is no bias, and the second purpose is to make sure that you can actually provide the right kind of justification for the method, that why the method is such a good method. That's, at the end of the day, if you cannot prove that your research method was the right thing to do, then people would not really pay much attention to the claim that you're making, the research claim that you're making, right? So that's the thing. Now, just to follow up from last episode, because this is the context that I will be continuing with. There are 8 different tribes of research methods. When we talk about research methods, there are different types of research methods, and primarily there are 8 different types of research methods. So I talked a little bit in details last time, like, there are surveys, there are interviews, there are focus group studies, So in order to establish a claim, you can do any one or more of these 8 types of research method in order to establish your claim. So you can do surveys, you can do interviews, focus group studies, where you bring together a community, a small gathering of participants, and you try to conduct some sort of a group discussion or some sort of a combined group interview, and try to figure out from their responses and so on, certain kind of conclusions. You want to draw certain kind of conclusions. So that becomes your finding, whatever you get. Or you can get the findings from doing proper case studies, and many such case studies are done, especially in the field of biomedical sciences. Or you can also do different types of observational studies. And one category is when you are where you are part of the participants. The other kind of observational study is where you are not part of the participants. And then there are observational trials, and one kind of observation trials are clinical trials. And then there's something called the Delphi method, which is primarily used to do predictions. And what you do essentially over there, as I discussed in the earlier episode, that you bring all the experts together and try to combine their individual opinions, and then try to do some sort of a prediction on the basis of their individual opinions of the experts. And then finally, there are experiments, which we do a lot in natural sciences and mathematical sciences and so on. So those are that's the 8th category. Last time, I focused primarily on experiments, and I showed how to evaluate via experiment, how to use experiments to evaluate your research method. This time, I'm going to cover almost all of these 8, and I'm going to show you, irrespective of whatever is your research method, there are certain things that you should be very careful about when you are conducting your research, or rather your experiments, right? And by experiments, for this particular session, for this particular episode, what I mean by an experiment is, I mean all of these 8 methods, and I would consider that to be like, each one of them can be considered as an experiment in some sense, right? So it's not necessarily that everything has to be like a lab experiment where you're intervening at multiple stages and trying to observe certain thing, but even surveys can be considered as one kind of experiment. Interviews can be considered as one kind of experiment. In that sense, in a loose sense, I would use the word experiment. So whenever I'm, from now onwards, in this particular episode, whenever I'm using the word experiment, you can safely assume that I mean all of these 8 categories, right? So this is going to be the topic, the central topic of tonight. And if you look at this cartoon, it's kind of hilarious, but to a lot of extent, it actually happens. Like, what is the right method? The right scientific method is that you observe a natural phenomena, and then you formulate a hypothesis on the basis of the observation, and then you test the hypothesis via a rigorous experiment. And if you see that there's some issues, the experimental results are not really supporting the hypothesis, then you go back and you modify the hypothesis, and again you test the hypothesis. And when there is a green signal, which means when the results are actually supporting your hypothesis, then you establish a theory based on repeated validation of the results, right? So that's the proper approach. However, a lot of times what happens is, especially in today's world of, when there is a constant pressure of publication, and, we all know that we are living in this bubble, I would say, of publish or perish. And in that kind of a situation, sometimes what happens is that you actually make up a theory based on the funding agency manager, what the funding agency would want something to be true. Of course, it's a little bit exaggerated over here because it's just a cartoon. It's a comical caricature of what actually the reality is, but you can understand what it means, uh, and then on the basis of that, you design some minimum experiments that will sort of suggest the theory is true. Of course, it won't be able to prove anything, but it will sort of suggest that the theory is true. Then you publish a paper and you rename the theory a hypothesis and pretend that you have done something, you have used a scientific method. And many times while when you are publishing the paper, you would be modifying the theory a little bit to fit the data, and then you defend the theory despite all evidences that go against the theory. So uh, although caricature, but I guess you get the point that what I'm trying to say is that this is not good research. This is not honest research, and this is not something that will be helping you in the long run to establish yourself as a really, really genuine and really proper, reputed researcher in your community. That's for sure. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what are all the problems that can happen when you conduct experiments, or when you try to evaluate your approach, or whatever kind of experiment you do. And again, just to remind you, by experiment I mean all the 8 different categories of research methods. So what can go wrong from the researcher's side, which is us? So the very first thing I want to talk about is the very first thing that happens when somebody starts conducting an experiment is they fall into the trap of selection bias, right? And usually there are multiple different kinds of selection bias. I just picked up the most important, in the sense of the most prevalent ones. And one such bias is sampling bias, in the sense of how you actually select your participants, who are your samples, or if you are doing some sort of a lab experiment, then whatever entity or animals or plants or whatever you are taking, or virus or bacteria, whatever you're taking as your sample, or if you're doing some sort of mathematical science or statistical science based, if your research is something about that, then what kind of data set you are using. So there can be several biases over there, and I will specifically talk about, just in the next slide, I will specifically talk about sampling bias, like what are the different forms of this devil. There is another kind of selection bias, which is time interval bias. And what do we mean by that? A lot of times what happens is that when you're conducting an experiment, and at certain point, let's say in the experimental phase, you suddenly get some results that are supporting your hypothesis. And then what happens, you have this inclination that, okay, done, I've got the support that I needed, and you just stop the experiment without conducting it further. So essentially, if the experiment had to run for, let's say, 1 month or 2 months, you just stop it, let's say, in between. And just because you got some results which are supporting your hypothesis. Now, this is what we call as time interval bias. Don't do that. If the experiment in a controlled environment, whatever you are doing, if that requires a certain period of time, and a lot of times we break it into time intervals also, that we first look at the result in this period of time, and then we choose another time period, and then we choose another time period, and we try to keep seeing whether we are getting similar results or very close results or not at different time points. And do that, be rigorous over there. don't do this, that the moment you get the first positive signal and you stop it. So don't do that, right? That wouldn't be good research, right? And if you are under the scrutiny of a very good reviewer, it will be, the reviewer can probably might sense that something like that has happened. If your results are not really going well with the intuition that usually the research community would have about whether such evidences or whether such findings can even be possible, right? The third kind of selection bias is what we call as exposure bias, and it happens a lot in clinical trials, and in biomed and in pharma. And what happens over there is, and if you guys are from that kind of a discipline, or if if anyone watching this video either now or later, or they would understand it, they would be able to connect with it. So what happens over here is that a lot of times there are all sorts of observable variables that you want to observe, and you want to figure out what is their effect of each one of these variables. What is the effect of that variable? But a lot of times, what happens is that these variables are kind of like causally connected to each other. And if you don't understand the causal relationship, if you are not aware of the causal relationship, then what happens is that you look at the side effect or the effect of the particular variable as if like that effect is coming only from that variable, but it is very much possible that that effect is coming from the other variable that is actually the cause of this variable, or can actually come from a combination of these two variables, which means the causal variable and this variable which you are studying. And many times what happens is that the causal variable is not you did not even think about the causal variable. You did not even think about observing the causal variable. And the moment you get some result, you try to associate the effect. You try to associate the effect with the wrong cause, where the cause was something else. So, so this can, like as an example, I'm just giving you an example. Let's say that A causes B, and B has the effect of C. B causes C. Now, C is actually caused primarily because of A, which means that if you take out A, if you just eliminate A from that entire equation, then you will not see C anymore. B cannot produce C anymore. So a lot of times that is one of the things that we have to understand, that is there any A? No, if you only look at C and then you try to connect C with B and say that, okay, B is what is causing C, then probably there is a mistake, because actually it was A which was pushing B towards C, right? So these sort of things can happen, and you have to be very careful about it. Of course, these are things that happens a lot in clinical trials, but it doesn't mean that it won't happen in other kind of disciplines, and it can very well happen that it can be very implicit even in kind of these kind of experiments, which requires qualitative experiments like surveys and questionnaires and focus group studies and so on and so forth. It can happen even over there also. So you have to be very sure about what you're observing, how that is connected with something else, which might actually be affecting what you are seeing, the effect that you are seeing, right? Okay, so that's selection bias. By the way, I will go one bias at a time, and I will, the entire point of today's discussion is to tell you what not to do, okay, when you are actually conducting the experiments. So you have to make sure that you don't do sampling bias, you don't get into the trap of time interval bias, and you don't get into the trap of exposure bias, right, as far as selection bias is concerned. So I'll just complete the selection bias by discussing a little bit about sampling bias, and then let's see if we can take some questions in between. Otherwise, I'll move ahead. So sampling bias, if you look at sampling bias, there are like, what it really means is that, let's say that you are selecting a data, some data set, on which you would be conducting your experiment. Okay. Or let's say that you are selecting some respondents, some people, some group of people for your surveys or case studies or focus groups and so on. And a lot of times what happens is during the such selection process, when you're selecting, or when you're this collectively is called sampling. You are actually sampling. Why you are sampling? You're sampling to study that sample so that you can estimate the population of that sample, which means you can generalize from that. The idea, the entire idea of sampling based experiments is to generalize. So whatever you see as an outcome of the sample study, you would now want to estimate what might happen in the general population. All right. So, but then there can be certain things that can happen while you are doing this sampling. One is that there's something called self-selection. And what is self-selection? Self-selection happens a lot during surveys, where respondents are voluntarily participating. They are voluntarily coming to you and saying that, yeah, I want to participate in your experiment. But then a lot of times, the reason why they want to participate in an experiment can be screwed up in multiple ways, right? So they might be self-selecting themselves for not really because they want to give some honest response, but just because maybe one reason can be just because they want to earn some money, and you have some money tag on that particular case study or focus group or whatever that you are doing, that experiment that you are running. And they might just come for the money, and they are not really honest about their responses and so on and so forth. Another thing can be about the glamour. Let's say that your project or is very popular, or you are like a celebrity or something like that, and they just come just because of the glamour associated with that study, and they just want to be part of it. Another reason can be that they they just want to join the particular study because their friends are there, and the friends have told them to come over here, come into the survey, and they are just obligated in some sense, and they just come and volunteer. Whereas probably there may be a good possibility that they are not really that serious, or they are already biased, right? So in terms of how they will be responding, right? So you have to make sure that whoever you are bringing in as the study, they don't self-select themselves in the wrong way. They don't self-select themselves in the wrong way. So that's one thing. The second thing is more about like, this is extremely important, that, the data set that you are choosing, or the bunch of people or the respondents that you are choosing, or the cases that you are choosing, if you are doing a case study, that should be representative enough to be consistent with your research scope and assumptions. And this is very, very, very important, because you have taken certain assumptions when you started out with the research question, right? And you also defined the research scope, the scope of your research, the boundary within which you would be carrying the research, the domain within which you would be carrying the research, so that you have defined that properly. Now, your data set, if you are choosing a data set to conduct some experiments, has to be consistent with that. The data set cannot be something that actually is defying or contradicting the assumptions, or contradicting the research scope, or if not contradicting, it is not, it is not fully distributed over all the different key assumptions that you have, or the scope of the research that you have. It doesn't really represent every single case or every single scenario of your research question, how you have defined your research question. So make sure that your data set or the people who are participating or the cases, they are consistent. I mean, this is something that is very important, this consistency. I can't stress enough. And this, because this happens a lot, this, if you have to ask me, like, Suresh, tell me, one of those things that you have personally experienced, people facing the biggest challenge about when such biases come and they are not really doing it intentionally, is actually this one. Is actually this one you know so it happens a lot in a very unintentional way, quite inadvertently. This thing comes in, just creeps in, and you don't even, many times you don't even know as a researcher that this has crept in. uh, One of the ways to avoid it is that you do random selection, or random sampling, what we call. And there are multiple different techniques of doing random sampling. And there are, if you are doing quantitative research, then there are multiple different statistical techniques of doing random sampling. Even in qualitative research also, the way you choose your respondent, you can do it. There are different techniques that will help you to make sure that your the people who you choose for the, let's say, an interview or focus discussion or whatever, are randomly selected, right? And another thing is that this is another problem with sampling, which is what we call as survivorship sampling. And what happens in survivorship sampling is that, a lot of times you just bring people in who qualify certain eligibility criteria or something, and you just because, simply because they are easily accessible, they are easily available, and just because they said yes, and you just go with them, and because they are and they have come maybe because they have already gone through a similar study that you did before, like 2 months back or 5 months back, and the same set of people have come back again, and you feel like, okay, I don't need any change over there. I can conduct my experiment with the same set of people, with the same bunch of people, right? And you again conduct another survey or another case study or another focus group or whatever that is. You again conduct the same thing with the same people. So don't do that. Okay, so this is what I call as what people call as survival. Like, if survivor means people who have survived the previous experiments are getting chosen, and people who were not taken in the previous experiments are not getting chosen in the next experiments. So you have to make sure that it's not the same set of people you are bringing in over and over and over, right? Because definitely, if you do that, bias is going to creep in, right? And I will talk about what kind of, there's an interesting bias that happens, when which we call as the previous experiment is somehow influences. So if I am a participant if I participated in your experiment in back in July, and if you're doing another experiment in, let's say, September, I have the memory of what I did in July, and that might influence how I would be participating in your experiment in September. And that happens. That is what the problem is with survivorship or sampling. And then there are other factors also, like the timing. The timing when you actually, especially with people, when you deal with human subjects, then the timing matters a lot, and the authenticity of if you're using certain data, right? Then the authenticity of the data, from where did you get that data set? That matters a lot. Or if you are using certain channels of distribution for, let's say, your surveys or your questionnaires, so what channel of distribution you're choosing, that might matter as well, right? So if you're distributing it via friend circles, so friend and friend of friend and so on, it might happen that, or or relatives and so on. And so that can be problematic. That can itself, the channel of distribution of your surveys and all that can itself cause bias. So this is primarily what you have to make sure that just pay attention to this, and make sure that when you are actually conducting your experiment, where in the process of doing experiments, you should try to make sure that these things are not happening, right? So let me see if so far there is any questions or comments or something that people want to discuss. Okay, so hi, Mayura. Great to see you. Would love to know what you are working on. And okay, so let me see if there are some questions. I think Vidya has Vidya has one question. How can we see that conducting random sampling responsible for sampling bias? Actually, it's the other way around. What I'm saying, Vidya over here probably got it wrong. Actually, this is like how to avoid it, which means that you should conduct uh, random selection or random sampling to avoid these biases, right? So that's what the point was. So you are right that you should be doing random sampling to avoid sampling bias, right? Okay, so who else is there? Let me see if I can put all these chats together. Yeah. Let's see if I have visitors in Crowdcast. I don't know how many visitors will be there in Crowdcast. Snehal is there in Crowdcast. Hi, Snehal. Great to see you. Okay, so any questions so far? Any questions about selection bias and sampling bias? I would like to know a little bit about, like, for those people who are watching it now, have you faced these sort of things, or do you worry about such things? Like sampling bias or selection bias in general. Sampling bias is a kind of selection bias. So in general, do you think that you get into these issues, these concerns, and in your own research experience? And I would love to know about that. How do you work it out? Just put it, if you have gone through such things, then or if it is new to you, just say new, this is very new to me. Or if it is not new to you, and if you have encountered such things and you actually take certain procedures to mitigate it, then just say yes, I do take precautions, and then probably we can do some chatting on that. Let's see if I can pop it out. Otherwise, I'm going to continue. If there is no questions or no comments, okay, maybe I should continue. I don't think at this moment anybody has any question. Let me just check out one more time if I have questions on Crowdcast. I don't think I have any questions from anybody. Hi, Snehal. Okay, so let's go to the second part. So now there is another kind of bias that you have to be very careful about when you are doing your experiments. Um, and these are biases that will come from your side. Okay, so because you have control over, which means that you have control over avoiding in terms of avoiding these biases. So first of all, when it comes to data, don't do cherry picking. And this is something that may sound a little bit, may not sound nice, but a lot of times what happens, I've seen people doing it, that they only choose the sort of data which will support their hypothesis, and they exclude those sort of data that they know wouldn't really support their hypothesis that much, or maybe wouldn't strongly support their hypothesis. So don't do cherry picking when it comes to data selection or sample selection, and you have to be very careful in an unbiased way. When you are doing data cleanup or denoisification, a lot of times during, before we even conduct our experiments, we have to do data cleaning. This is reality. Data comes with a lot of noises. And when you do data cleaning, a lot of times what you do is that you actually clean up a lot of stuffs that are not necessary, or that will that will like negatively affect your results. And many times what happens is that you, while cleaning it up, you are striking off certain properties or certain dimensions of the data, or certain features of the data that are actually should have been kept, right? And that should not have been cleaned up. So it's almost like while cleaning up your house, you are actually cleaning up a lot of stuff that are important and should stay in the house, and you just threw it out. So you have to be very careful while you do data cleanup, that what are the features that should not be touched during the cleanup process and that should remain there, and what are the features that are definitely genuine noises, and you should be cleaning that, right? So the third thing is that you should avoid excluding important ablation variables or parameters. Like, what is ablation? Uh, so a lot of times, especially in those sort of research which would require statistical analysis, you actually, what you do is that if there are multiple variables that will, or parameters that you would want to observe to figure out how one variable is affecting the findings as compared to the other variables, which means that if you are suppressing some of the variables, if you're taking out some of the parameters, then how the findings come out, versus if you take, so essentially it's a combination of you're trying to see multiple different combinations of the total number of variables or parameters that actually affect the findings, and you're trying to see how, if you take out something, then the findings get changed, or whether at all they get changed or not, and to what extent they get changed, and then you try to understand why that change is happening, right? So that is called ablation study. And but a lot of times what happens during ablation study is uh, the variables that you should be looking at to understand how they affect certain findings or results uh, should be part of the ablation study. And a lot of times what happens is that you kind of miss out on certain variables that should have been part of the study, but was excluded from that study, which means that you should definitely have try to figure out whether that particular variable as a standalone, how that affects the findings, right? And you did not do that. So those are the kind of biases that what we mean as ablation biases. So if you are doing an ablation study, you have to be very careful that you are actually choosing those variables that matter, that people would really care for. And if you're not choosing them, then first of all, if you're at the hand of a very good reviewer, then the reviewer is definitely going to question that, right? And even if it goes through into the research community, the research community is definitely going to question it, and your entire reputation and expertise level, all are under questions at that time then. So be very, very careful when you do this. And finally, a lot of times what happens is you kind of like exclude some very important observable variables, which means some variables that you should have observed, but you have not even kept in the study at all. And don't do that, because those are again another kind of exclusion variable, exclusion bias. So don't exclude something that should have been part of the study, right? So this is something that we need to be careful about as researchers. It's our responsibility, it's our duty to do to make sure that we don't exclude things which matters, right? So that's exclusion bias. Then comes the observer bias, and by observer is us, like we as researchers. And there are different kind of things, and it's kind of because at the end of the day we are human being as well. So we are very passionate about our hypothesis, and we are many times we become very emotionally attached to our hypothesis. So a lot of times what happens is that we fall into the trap of confirmatory bias, in the sense that I observe what I want to observe, or I try to observe what I want to observe. Like I've already made up my mind that this is what I would like to observe, and I have to somehow observe this, and somehow I'm play around with my variables or my data set or my parameters to make sure that I actually get to what I really want to observe. And then there is another kind of issue, observer bias, which is called as begging the question, which is I conclude what I want to conclude. So it's kind of premeditated. I already want to conclude this, and this thing. And that's why somehow I'm trying to make something out of the findings or the result that I got to conclude what I already have decided to conclude, right? So that's called begging the question, and that's something that is again another big problem. It makes these are the two things that will make your papers very, very weak, and it's almost guaranteed that you wouldn't be able to get it accepted in any standard journal or conference proceeding if these two things are happening. So there's no point even to even go in this direction, uh, because the entire point of writing a paper is like a waste of time, because you actually spend so much of time writing the paper, right? So it's a lot better that you don't do these things when you're actually in the experiment stage, when you're actually experimenting. Make sure you don't do these two things. So there's no real need when you are in the research stage, right? No real need to actually be emotionally attached with the hypothesis. You have a hypothesis, that's fine. Everybody needs to start with a hypothesis, but you need to be honest, and you need to maybe having a very open mind. And a lot of times what happens is that what I discussed way back, you need to understand something very, very important over here. This diagram, if you look at what actually really it should be, like every time you have a hypothesis, and if the hypothesis is failing and or not really, you're not getting that much of support, then you can always go back and you can always modify the hypothesis. And this is what should happen during your research stage. And don't just hurry into writing a paper just because of the sake of publication and quickly publishing something which actually is not, sorry about that. Oops. Okay, which actually is not going to be helpful, right? So so always remember that during the research process you always have the chance of going back and redesigning or reworking on your hypothesis, and make sure that you actually get to a very solid hypothesis. And that's kind of the iteration process. Any good researcher goes through that, so don't worry about that part. But don't just go ahead without having making sure that your findings are completely consistent with your assumptions that you have taken, or the scope of the research that you have like the boundary within which you are actually doing this research, and of course the approach that you have taken. So your findings should be consistent with that, right? So then there is something which is very important, especially in today's time, and this is something I want to like. I intentionally tried to bring this. I made sure that I actually talk about this, which is called prejudice bias. And a lot of times, what happens is that when you're trying to select your data or your sample, you're trying to collect the sample or select the sample for your sample study, for whatever kind of research you are trying to do. Uh, there's multiple times what happens is that there are a lot of cultural influences that come into the picture when you are trying to select certain data set, or there are and I'm not saying that it happens intentionally, because usually cultural influences and stereotyping some people or some community or some group, or it can be gender specific also. So these things happen a lot without us thinking about it, in the sense that what we do is usually we already have a prior assumptions about certain phenomena, certain event, certain people, set of people, certain community, or certain kind of behavioral aspect of human society. And this prior assumption doesn't really come, they are not really founded well. They come from our cultural influences, how we are brought up, what kind of culture we are brought up in, and so on and so forth. And they are not really founded scientifically on certain findings and certain results that have been published in some papers or something like that, right? And that's one of the reason, like I give you one example, like for a long period of time, at some point, way back in England, used to happen that people used to think that the IQ, the general IQ level, the intelligence quotient, it has a lot to do with the status, the class status, like, which means that if you are from a very higher class of society, your intellectual quotient, your IQ is going to be very high. And if you're from a lower class of society, then your intellectual quotient is going to be low. And in that, with that particular kind of stereotypification, if there exists a word like that, what happens is that what the UK government did at that time, this is like way back, and they actually categorize schools for kids on the basis of that. So, and then later on it was clearly visible that there is just no correlation between IQ and status and class status. So these are the kind of things and these were done by not just by lay people, common people. These were done by social scientists who were very prominent social scientists at that time. And they took this as a prior assumption, and they went on and did their studies and even published papers on the basis of this, right? So later on it got all refuted, right? So that is the thing. So you don't want to do that with your own research, so you have to be very careful about your prior assumptions. Are those prior assumptions well founded, well grounded? How often do they hold true? How often are they true, the assumptions that you have? And is there any meaningful correlation between between variables within those assumptions, like or is it just an accidental correlation, or is it an unknown correlation? You cannot really explain why A is associated with B. So don't give a meaning to it without actually properly investigating it in terms of research methodology, right? So you cannot just take a prior assumption that A, okay, I already assume that A is associated with B. A relates with B in a particular way. Let's say A causes B, and now on the basis of that assumption, I'm starting my experiments and my research. Uh, that is not how it should work. You should first make sure that actually A causes B is true, or to what extent it is true, and then only you should proceed, right? So this is what I call as prejudice bias. And then there is something that is measurement bias that as researchers we can do. And by measurement bias, it has much to do with the device or the instrument that you're using for gathering data, for observation. And the idea is basically to avoid noisy data gathering or incorrect interpretation, because if there is if your device has some issues, or the mechanism in which you're observing certain thing, if that has some problem, then you would definitely end up having incorrect interpretation of your results or of your findings, right? So make sure that those things are all in place. If possible, it is always one of the ways to avoid measurement bias is to actually do the experiments with multiple different types of devices. That's what I mean by multimodal. And in a multimodal setup, what you should do is that you should compare the interpretations that you are drawing out of every devices or every instruments observations, and you should compare the interpretations, and you should check to what extent they are consistent with each other. Are they consistent with each other, the interpretations that you are drawing from device number one, and the interpretations that you are getting from device number two, and the interpretations that you are getting from device number three. And these three devices can actually be complementing each other. They may not actually be looking at the same thing, but they may just be complementing each other. But even then, you need to make sure that the interpretations or the conclusions that you are drawing are actually going hand in hand with each other. Because if they are not going hand in hand, like one kind of like contradicts the other, then definitely there is some issue, and you have to investigate whether your devices are working properly or not, or whether your way of looking into or doing the experiment and gathering or the data or observing the data is really proper or not, right? So that's what we mean as measurement bias. And I guess this is kind of an important thing, because a lot of, especially even in social sciences, and to some extent even in humanities these days, people are moving more and more towards methods that are more taken in STEM research. And one of the key ways in which people are moving towards that kind of methodology, scientific methodology, is using statistical analysis. But when you do statistical analysis itself, there can be multiple different types of bias. And one kind of bias is called data dredging, or in some sense it's also called p-hacking, in the sense that it's almost like you want a particular kind of p-value, let's say, and which is essentially a way to understand correlation between two phenomena, let's say, and or two events. And what you do is what we call as data dredging, which means you try to sort of play with the data in a way where you can actually get the right kind of correlation. And that is not something that you should be doing, either accidentally or intentionally, of course. And another interesting thing that I see while being a reviewer myself in some of the good venues is that, a lot of times I've seen people choosing the incorrect statistics to show good. It's almost like, and this is one of the reasons why, there is a old saying that there are three types of lies: lie, damn lie, and statistics. And one problem with that is that you can always use a different statistics to show something to coming out to be good. But the moment you use a different kind of statistics, the same thing might come out to be bad. And a perfect example is where the average may turn out to support your hypothesis if you just do a simple average or some sort of an average, maybe weighted average, whatever that is. But the moment you do a standard deviation, you are clearly seeing that that's not really supporting your hypothesis. So I'm just giving you an example. So this is something that is very, very common. And make sure that you are actually choosing the right kind of statistics, because your reviewer, if he's really good, and if good journals means good reviewers, and they will definitely catch you on these points, right? So you have to make sure that you are using the right kind of statistic. It's almost very analogous to using the right kind of device, which I talked in the previous slide. And this is pretty much a very similar thing. And because it's also like a device to come to a conclusion. Statistics is like a device to come to a conclusion. And then there's another problem that I see, and this happens a lot, especially with correlation analysis and hypothesis testing, a lot in hypothesis testing. And what happens over there is that a lot of times certain kind of statistics are incorrectly interpreted and to derive to a conclusion. So what the statistics is not meant to be, you are trying to use that statistics to show something what it is not meant to be, what it was not designed to conclude against. So it's kind of like you are using one statistics which is actually designed for a very different purpose to show something else, to support something, to show something else. So don't do that. There is another kind of bias that can happen when you do statistical analysis, which is data partitioning. So a lot of times when you do data partitioning, you have to do data partitioning, in the sense of especially when you do sample studies, and make sure that your partitions are not biased, which means you're not partitioning the data in a way such that every sample is going to support your hypothesis. So whenever you're trying to like carve out intentionally, instead of doing a random partitioning, you're essentially trying to design the partition. You are intervening within the partition. You know what the partition looks like. You already know. You have a clear idea. You're hand picking, almost cherry picking the partition. You start to create the partitions, and then you're trying to do your experiment so that every partition is actually supporting your hypothesis. And this leads to a different thing, which is what we call as Simpson's paradox. Because a lot of times, if you do that, what happens is that, and for those people who don't know Simpson's paradox, what happens is, if you combine the partition, if you just mix the partition into a bigger partition, two partitions, and let's say that if you merge the two partitions into a bigger partition, and a lot of times what the smaller partition was able to support, the bigger partition is not able to support that anymore. The moment you bring these two together and try to again run the experiment and try to again find this findings, you're not able to support your hypothesis anymore. And this is called Simpson's paradox. And that's one of the reasons that randomization of the partitions and mixing up your cross poles, these are all always techniques that you can use so that you make sure that these sort of stuffs are not happening. And finally, this is something very important if you're trying to understand causality, or if your experiment is about figuring out causalities, which is confounding. So there is always something called confounding variables. I tell you a kind of thing, and with an example, let's say, so to make you understand what are confounding variables for those people who are not familiar with the term. So it has been observed through data that Nobel laureates, there is a huge correlation with chocolates and Nobel laureates. So chocolates and Nobel laureates have a lot of very, very strong correlation. So you might be tempted to conclude that Nobel laureates actually love chocolates, but there was this third hidden confounding variable called first world countries, or the advanced countries, so to say, the countries which are tier one in the sense of economy. And it actually happens to be that is the confounding effect, which means it's the tier one countries, the developed countries, which is actually called that variable is actually causing this correlation to happen, because most Nobel laureates are from advanced countries or developed countries, and chocolate consumption is really very high in the developed countries, and that's why it was this third parameter which you did not look at, you did not observe, which is the developed countries parameter or the countries parameter, and that actually brought these two together, chocolates and Nobel laureates, right? So you may, if you don't look into these confounding variables, you may come out with a very wrong conclusion about correlation. So this is one of the biggest issues, right, when you are doing, and you really need to make sure that are there any confounding variables associated, and you need to detect that very early, right? And that's part of your modeling as well. Now, before I go into the other side of the story, and I would conclude on that, I want to see if there are some questions, and then within another 3-4 minutes, I will conclude the participant side of the story, which means that participants can also create a lot of bias. Any questions so far? Hi, Opoku. How are you? Any questions? Any questions so far? Otherwise, I'll just try to wrap it up. Any questions? Okay, so let me just go into the final part of it. So what happens when your research, or rather your experiment, includes participants? You are doing qualitative research, let's say, and it requires a human participants, right? Now, there can be biases. So far, we discussed all those kind of issues that can happen from your side. Now, I'm talking about the issues that can happen from the participant side. And from the participant side, there is something called participant bias. And what it means is that, you have to be super careful when you're trying to, trying to work with your participants, that, how you, as a researcher, might influence your participants' responses, right? And what are the different ways in which such influence can happen? One way is what we call as social desirability bias, which means that a lot of times your participants are not comfortable with telling you the truth because they want to tell something where they look good, right? So as an example, if I ask you, so do you have a lot of issues with understanding papers, let's say. Now, you might want to look good, and you might want to give me an answer saying that, no, I don't have any issues, right? Because you are going after a social desirability, right? That socially you are not acceptable if you say, you're supposed to understand papers, almost like as if, and then everybody is going after that. Well, I want to look good about it. So to avoid such issues, what you can do is that you can make the entire survey or questionnaire, or even there can be mechanisms in which you can make the interview also confidential. And if you keep the confidentiality, then a lot of people will open up, and because they know that they would not be judged by anyone, right? The other thing is the call for participation when you're advertising out your to gather to get the participants in, and also the question formulation itself should be judgment free. So it has to be phrased in a way, the language that you would be using, the tone that you should be using should not carry judgments either way. So it not be like, if you answer certain things in certain ways, then I will judge you in a good way. If you answer certain things in certain way, then in a different way, then I'm going to judge you in a bad way. So those sort of tone should be avoided. There should not be any way in which you should be judging people. And then definitely you should have a randomized response technique. A lot of surveys, a lot of questionnaires, especially software-based surveys and questionnaires, they do that. You can do randomized response technique. Another problem that can happen is the halo effect, and the converse of that is the devil effect, which means that if somebody loves you and you are interviewing that somebody is going to please you and tell things which are biased. The other way around is that if somebody doesn't like you and you're interviewing that somebody, then that somebody can actually talk about things that are not true, but negative things, which are actually not true. And you have to make sure that this doesn't happen with your respondents. You have to make sure that your sample of respondents do not fall into the halo or the devil effect. Do not have that from you. And finally, there's this interesting behavior, which we call as acquiescence bias, in the sense that, if you have a yes question, then usually people tend to say yes as an answer. So, or if you have a no question, then, or a negative question, then people usually tend to say no as an answer, right? So you need to make sure that the phrase is not polarized. The phrases that you're using, the way you are designing the questions are not polarized in terms of yes or no. And you don't do leading questions, which means you actually, you don't do questions like this. I'm giving a very simple, silly example, like, hey, Sourish, you like watermelon, don't you? So this is going to be a leading question, that now what do I say? Like you said, you like watermelon, don't you? So those are like leading questions. So do not do that. And when you are designing the questionnaire or the survey, look for self-contradiction. So if you're trying to figure out whether I like citrus fruits, then and by asking me one question, then maybe after 5 questions or 6 questions, you can ask me again something that probes me into the fact that whether I really like citrus fruits or not, right? So you can do all these sort of things, right? So the other kind of bias is question answer order bias, and a lot of times if you don't play with the order in which you place the question, or even the answer for that matter, you can bias people. As an example, like your initial questions, it is seen that the initial questions are actually the crucial questions, because they bias the respondents towards how they will be answering the subsequent questions. So your initial question should be posed in a way, or should be crafted in a way, should be designed in a way where you make sure that it does not bias the next question. The first question should not bias the second answer of the second question. And the second question should not bias the answer of the third question. And in some sense, it is related to something what we call as assimilation effect, which means that you remember your recent past, like what you did recently, what kind of answer did you give recently. You remember that very well, and that actually influences how you would be answering the next question. So related questions, if you have two questions which are very related to each other, space them out. Don't keep them consecutively. Bring some other questions in between and then space these two questions out, right? To avoid the assimilation effect. And also the MCQs, try to minimize the MCQs as much as possible. I said reduce the yes, no kind of questions, balance it out with shades of gray. Likert scale, a lot of people use Likert scale for surveys, questionnaires and all. And there has been a lot of debates in terms of what is the right kind of Likert scale, like 5-point versus 7-point versus 10-point. And if you ask the same question with 5-point or 7-point or 10-point, you will invariably get different kind of answers. So you need to make sure that what kind of Likert scale you would be using. You have to use it in the right way, and not just the right way, but you have to use it at the right time, which means that with proper spacing. If you always ask, always put the answer as a Likert scale, like the question number 1, Likert scale, question number 2, Likert scale, question number 3, Likert scale, there can be a problem. Give some room, give some spacing. Because a lot of times what happens is that when people go into this MCQ kind of a mode, they keep doing the same thing because they want to get through the survey very quickly. So if I say 4 out of 5, then the next one most likely will be 3 or 4 out of 5, and then 4 out of 5, and so on. So it is biased essentially that way. So make sure that you don't do that. You keep a spacing between two Likert scale kind of questions. So this is where we all want to reach, and this entire episode is to reach here, where you see Cecilia submitting the final set of results, and the professor says good, and after that she's so happy. This is where we need to reach, right? So when the dissertation is done, and this is where it's all about. This is like research. The entire research is all about, right? So stay tuned for next Wednesday. What we are going to discuss about on next Wednesday is we are going to figure out how to interpret the findings or the results that you have, and how to use them in the proper way to support your, how to actually use them to support your claims that you are trying to make, right? So stay tuned, and I hope there isn't any questions so far. Let me just quickly figure out whether there are any questions. Okay, no questions from Idris. Hi Idris, by the way. Very happy New Year to you, and to all of you, by the way. Any questions? Otherwise, we should wrap up because we are already over time tonight. Okay, so thanks a lot for joining in again one more time, and we would meet again next Wednesday. And till that time, stay very safe, very healthy, take very good care of yourself and your family. Bye. Have a very great night.